My name is Olivia Parker, and I'm 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, at my own housewarming party, my father stood up with a glass of wine in his hand and announced to a room full of my friends and family that the down payment money he'd given me was being returned and handed straight to my sister instead. He said it like a gift. He said it like generosity. Everyone raised their glasses. What nobody in that room knew, including my father, was that 3 days earlier, I had already refinanced my mortgage in full. The arrangement he thought he still controlled had been closed, signed, and settled without a single phone call to warn him. He was toasting to money that no longer belonged to him in any legal sense at all. I want to tell you about the exact moment his face changed. When he realized the papers he was about to celebrate weren't a gift he was giving away. They were proof of a debt already paid in full. But to understand how we got to that dining room, you have to go back to where this money actually came from, and what it really cost me. I bought my house 4 years ago, when I was 27. I'm a project manager at a logistics firm, and I got there the boring way. No windfalls, no shortcuts. 6 years of the same beige apartment, the same generic coffee instead of the good stuff, a car I drove until the check engine light became part of the dashboard. By the time I started house hunting, I had $31,000 saved on my own. I didn't need help. I told my father that directly, more than once. He gave me the money anyway. $40,000, wired into my account 2 weeks before closing, with a text that just said, "Family takes care of family." I remember staring at that number for a long time, because I already understood something about my father that I'd learned the hard way growing up. Nothing he gave you was ever really a gift. It was a thread, and he kept the other end in his hand, and he could pull it whenever he wanted something back. So I did what I always do. I made it official in my own head, even if he never asked me to. I set up a recurring transfer, $400 a month, straight into his account, no note, no explanation, just quiet and consistent. 40,000 divided down to the dollar, paid back over time, until 8 months ago when the last transfer cleared and the debt was, by any reasonable measure, gone. He never once acknowledged a single payment. Not a thank you, not a text, nothing. I used to wonder if he even noticed the money landing every month, or if he'd simply filed it away as one more thing I owed him that could never actually be settled. My sister Megan is 26, and she has never once had to learn that lesson, because she's never had to pay anything back. Her car was replaced twice after accidents that were her fault. Her wedding, the one that didn't happen, cost my parents $11,000 in non-refundable deposits nobody ever mentioned again. When her business idea collapsed last year, 6 months of her rent quietly disappeared into my father's version of family loyalty, and nobody called it a loan, because with Megan, it never was one. That was the rule in our house, even though nobody ever said it out loud. Money my father gave you wasn't yours. It was a leash with some slack in it, and he decided when to pull. By the time I stood in my new kitchen last month, unpacking boxes, I genuinely believed I was the one exception. I'd paid every dollar back. In my mind, the leash was cut. I had no idea he still thought he was holding it. The housewarming was supposed to be simple. 20 people, string lights on the patio, a folding table doing its best impression of a bar. My father asked to say a few words before dinner, which wasn't unusual, so I handed him the room without thinking twice. He talked for a minute about how proud he was, how far I'd come. Then he said that with Olivia settled now, truly settled, it only felt fair that the $40,000 he'd given me for this house get put toward Megan's next chapter instead. He called it balance. He called it what any good father would do for his daughters. Someone near the grill actually clapped. I stood there holding a plate I hadn't touched, and on the outside, I didn't move. No sharp intake of breath, no reaction anyone would remember later as a moment. Inside, though, I was already running numbers, already 3 steps ahead, because some part of me had been bracing for this without fully admitting it. My mother had mentioned Megan's new business idea twice in the last month, a little too casually. My father had asked, out of nowhere, whether my mortgage was in my name alone. I'd noticed. I just hadn't let myself finish the thought. I didn't correct him in front of 20 people. Not because I was frozen, and not because I agreed with a word of it. I stayed quiet because a housewarming isn't where you hand your father a lesson in front of an audience he can charm. Because I wanted a night to think before I said anything I couldn't soften later. And because, if I'm honest, some old habit in me still flinched at the idea of making a scene in a room full of people clapping for him. So I smiled, thanked him for the kind words, and let the toast finish. I had no intention of arguing that night. I already knew exactly what I was going to do instead. The text came 2 days later, while I was still unpacking kitchen boxes. My father doesn't usually write long messages, but this one ran to 4 lines. He said Megan's lease signing was coming up fast, and it would mean a lot if I could formalize the transfer by the end of the month. He closed with the line I'd heard my whole life in one version or another. What's given in this family gets shared in this family. He'd said it about vacations, about hand-me-down cars, about a Christmas bonus he once redirected without asking. I just never heard it aimed directly at something with my name already on the deed. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to see how far this would go before I said a single word about the refinance. It didn't take long to find out. My mother called the next evening, and she didn't mention the party at all. She talked instead about fairness, about how Megan had always struggled a little more, needed a little more, and how it would mean everything to see her sisters supporting each other the way families should. She used the word blessed twice. She used the word selfish 0 times, but I could hear it sitting right behind every sentence, patient, waiting for an opening. By the weekend, Megan had posted something to her friends, half joking, half not, about finally getting her fair share after years of watching her sister get handed everything first. I hadn't spoken to her since the party. She hadn't asked me a single question about any of it. She'd simply absorbed our father's version of events and started planning her next few months around money that had already been spent settling a debt she didn't know existed. If you've ever watched your family build an entire narrative about you using information that's already outdated, tell me in the comments, because I want to know how you handled it. I didn't correct anyone yet. I was still gathering my own paperwork, still waiting for the right moment instead of the easiest one. The last escalation came on a Tuesday, and it was the one that told me exactly how serious my father intended to get. He'd looped in Gary, an old friend of his who happened to be a lawyer, into a group text with Megan and me, framed casually as just getting some friendly guidance on how to handle the transfer cleanly. Gary asked what structure I'd prefer for documenting the reallocation, as if this were already decided, as if I were simply the last signature standing between Megan and a check. Nobody had asked me a single question that assumed I might say no. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time that night, watching 3 people plan around a debt that had been paid off 8 months earlier, and none of them knew it. Part of me wanted to end it right there with one text. The house is refinanced. The $40,000 was paid back in full. There is nothing left to give. But I kept thinking about how that message would land in a group chat, stripped of context, easy to argue with, easy for my father to reframe before I even finished explaining myself. My refinance paperwork was already moving through final review that same week, the last signatures scheduled, the numbers locked, everything my father didn't know about quietly becoming real and irreversible. I made a decision sitting in my car outside the bank. I wasn't going to explain myself in a text message that Gary the lawyer could poke holes in. I was going to let the paperwork speak first, in person, where nobody could edit what it actually said. My father showed up at my house on a Thursday evening without calling first, a folder tucked under his arm like he'd already rehearsed the visit. Gary had drawn something up, he said, spreading 2 pages across my kitchen counter, right where I'd been unpacking mugs an hour earlier. A simple acknowledgement, he called it. A statement that the $40,000 had been a gift to me, and that I was voluntarily redirecting an equivalent amount to Megan. He'd even left a blank line for the amount, like he expected me to fill it in on the spot, at my own counter, standing in my own kitchen. I looked at that blank line for a long moment. Then my mother texted me separately, almost at the same time, mentioning that she'd already told my aunt and grandmother the money situation was handled, and that everyone was so relieved Megan finally had some stability coming. Handled. As if my signature were a formality nobody actually needed to ask me about. Something in me went very still and very clear. I told my father I needed a few days to think it over properly, and he left the folder on my counter like he was certain it would still be there, waiting, when he came back for it. That night I called my mortgage advisor, mostly to hear someone say it back to me in plain terms. She confirmed what I already knew. The refinance had fully closed. The original funds were repaid in full, documented, done. There was no remaining claim for anyone to sign away, because there was nothing left to give. I sat with that folder untouched on my counter and decided I wasn't going to explain any of this over the phone. I was going to bring my own paperwork to the next family dinner and let it do the talking. My mother scheduled Sunday dinner at their house that weekend, the kind with the good tablecloth and enough food for people who weren't coming. My father, my mother, Megan, and my Aunt Diane, who apparently now counted as a witness to family business. I brought a folder of my own, and I set it on the counter next to my father's the moment I walked in, like two competing bids nobody had asked for. We got through most of the meal on small talk before my father cleared his throat and slid his folder across the table toward me, right past the mashed potatoes, Gary's paperwork still sitting on top. He said he was glad I'd had time to think, that he knew I'd do the right thing, that all it needed was my signature at the bottom of page 2. Megan didn't look up from her plate, but I watched her hand go still around her fork. I didn't touch his folder. I opened mine instead, and I laid 3 pages flat on the tablecloth, turned so he could read them without reaching. The refinance agreement. The payoff statement. A transaction history showing $400 leaving my account and landing in his, every month, for 8 straight years, ending 8 months ago. The $40,000 was repaid in full, I said. It's documented right there. The house is refinanced in my name only, closed 3 days before the housewarming. There's nothing left for anyone to sign, because there's nothing left to give. The room went completely quiet in a way I'd never heard it go quiet before. My Aunt Diane looked down at her plate like she'd suddenly become very interested in green beans. My mother's hand stopped halfway to her water glass. My father picked up the payoff statement and read it twice, and I watched something happen to his face that I'd never seen there before. Not anger first. Confusion. Genuine, searching confusion, like a man checking his math and finding the numbers refusing to move where he'd left them. He looked up at me and said, almost quietly, "You've been paying this back the whole time?" As if 8 years of $400 transfers had happened in some room he'd never once walked into. I told him yes. Every month. Exactly as agreed, even though we never actually agreed on anything out loud. Megan finally looked up, and for the first time all night, she wasn't looking at our father. She was looking at me, like she was doing math of her own. Nobody at that table said another word for what felt like a very long time. My father just kept looking at that statement, like he was waiting for the numbers to apologize to him. He found me on the back porch a few minutes later, after my mother had ushered Megan and Diane into the kitchen for coffee nobody wanted. He sat down in the chair next to mine without asking, and for a while he just turned his wedding ring around his finger, the way he does when he's deciding which version of himself to use. "I've given you everything," he finally said. Not loud. Almost tired. College, the wedding money we never even got to spend on you, the down payment. And the first time I ask for something back, you hand me paperwork like I'm a stranger at closing. I told him I understood why it felt that way to him. And I meant it. But I also told him that a debt he never once acknowledged wasn't the same as a stranger. I'd paid it back exactly the way I'd have paid back a bank, quietly, on time, every month, and the only difference was a bank would have sent a letter saying paid in full. He never did. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I hadn't expected. He told me about his own father, how there'd been 4 kids, and never enough, how the only time real quiet ever came into that house was when his father handed someone cash and everyone stopped arguing for a night. He said he grew up believing that money was the only language his father knew how to say "I love you" in, and somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, he'd started speaking it the same broken way. I didn't say anything unkind to that. I let it sit there for a second, because I could see the shape of the boy underneath the man asking me for a signature. But understanding where a habit comes from isn't the same as agreeing to keep living inside it. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice level, the way I would in any room where the numbers mattered more than the noise. "You didn't ask me for help back there tonight. You asked me to disappear a debt I already paid, and call it generosity a second time. That's not family taking care of family. That's the leash again, just a longer one. He flinched at that word, leash, like I'd said something he didn't know I'd ever noticed. Maybe he hadn't realized I had a name for it. I'm not signing your paper, I told him. But I'm not walking away from Megan either. If she needs help getting into a place of her own, I'll talk to her directly, just the two of us, and we'll figure out what actually makes sense for her. Not what makes sense for you to announce over a toast. He didn't answer for a long moment. He looked out at the yard like it might have a better response written somewhere in the dark. Then he said quietly that he'd need some time to think about all of it, which from my father is as close to retreat as I'd ever heard him come. I told him that was fine. I wasn't in a hurry. I sat out there after he went back inside, listening to the murmur of voices through the screen door, and I didn't feel triumphant the way I'd imagined I might. I felt something closer to sad, actually, for the boy who learned that silence only ever came wrapped around money. But sad wasn't the same as sorry, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the old urge rising up to fix that feeling for him. Resolution and fallout. My father didn't call for almost 3 weeks after that night on the porch. That had never happened before in my entire life, 3 weeks of silence from a man who used to text me about oil changes and weather forecasts. I found out later from my mother that he'd been quiet at home too, the kind of quiet that isn't peace, just a man sitting with numbers he couldn't rearrange to come out the way he wanted. Megan and I didn't speak for almost 2 weeks either, and when we finally did, it wasn't easy. She admitted she'd been angry at first, not really at me, but at finding out the ground she'd been standing on for weeks had never actually existed. She said it stung to learn secondhand, through a folder on a dinner table, instead of hearing it from either of us directly. I told her she was right to be frustrated about that part, and I meant it. That one wasn't on our father alone. But underneath the sting, she said something else that surprised me. She said some small part of her was relieved, actually, to finally talk about money with me instead of always through him, like he was the only wire the whole family ran on. We ended up on the phone for almost an hour that night, just the two of us, talking honestly about her business idea for the first time without anyone translating it into a favor owed to someone else. My mother took longer to recalibrate than either of them. She still, for a while, floated the word family in that same careful tone, testing whether the old rules still applied. But slowly, over a few months, the calls changed. Less handled, more how are you actually doing? I think some part of her had believed his version of peace was the only kind available to her, and watching it not collapse when I stopped signing onto it quietly taught her something too. I won't pretend I felt nothing but relief through any of this. There was a Sunday in October I drove past my parents' street out of habit and didn't turn in, and something in my chest ached in a way I hadn't expected paperwork to cause. I loved my father. I still do. Loving him and refusing to keep funding his idea of love turned out to be two things I could hold at the same time, even when it was heavier than I expected. Then, near the end of that fall, Megan texted me out of nowhere, no mention of our father at all. She said she'd found a duplex near her office, asked if I'd come look at it with her on Saturday, just the two of us, like sisters who talk to each other directly now instead of through a man holding the phone line between us. I said yes, before I'd even finished reading the message. By winter, my house finally felt like mine in every sense of the word, not just the deed. Paid for, refinanced, uncontested, and quiet in the good way this time, not the way that used to mean somebody was waiting for me to give something back. I think about that folder on my kitchen counter sometimes, the blank line he left for me to fill in like I was overdue on something I'd already paid twice over. And I've come to believe there's a real difference between help that's freely given and help that's handed to you with an invisible string still tied to the other end, waiting to be pulled the moment it's convenient. Real generosity doesn't come back around later asking to be repaid a second time in gratitude, or loyalty, or silence at your own dinner table. If it does, it was never really a gift. It was a leash with some slack in it, dressed up in nicer language. I don't regret paying that money back quietly, month after month, for 8 years. But I've stopped believing that staying quiet is the same thing as keeping the peace. Sometimes the paperwork has to do the talking before anyone will actually listen. If someone in your family has ever tried to hand you a bill for something you already paid, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments, and tell me how you handled it. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, because next week I'm telling you about the wedding gift my mother tried to take back 3 years after the ceremony.